Afternoon and welcome to the Reentry Town Hall for Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition. Today we're going to be hearing from Deacon Larry Sutton of the Diocese of Pittsburgh. In particular, this is part 2 of a 3-part series. Today it's titled Recognizing People with Developmental Disorders Who Are Incarcerated or Detained and Identifying Tools for Effective Ministry. And he will be highlighting his work with Healthy Relationships Modules 1 and 2. But before we start with that, I'd like to, as we always do, open with prayer. So I invite you to just take a moment, take a few deep breaths, maybe find yourself in a grounded place with your feet flat on the floor, palms on your lap. Breathing in and out. In and out. And as you continue to breathe, I invite you to listen to this prayer, this poem. Let us breathe. Soften our shoulders. Relax our jaws. Let us release. Surrender our feet to the ground. Open our palms to the sky. Let us welcome. Lead with our hearts, accept with our hearing. Let us linger, dwell in the presence of the other, behold a space not yet revealed. Let us settle. Tend to our work with grace, honor our ability to serve, offering gratitude. Always offering gratitude. Amen. As I mentioned, we have Deacon Larry Sutton with us today. Deacon Larry is a deacon in the Diocese of Pittsburgh and the director of the Pre-Theology Formation Program at St. Vincent College and Seminary. In addition to his work at St. Vincent's, Dr. Sutton works as a psychologist at the Wesley Spectrum Services in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and was the former manager of the Western Region Office of the Bureau of Autism Services in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He earned his doctoral degree from the University of Pittsburgh in 1980 and has been licensed as a psychologist in Pennsylvania since 1983. Dr. Sutton has also worked with criminal justice-related issues since the 1980s, including work with individuals who had either a developmental or psychiatric disorder. He worked in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's Bureau of Juvenile Justice Services Manager of Psychological Services from 2004 to 2007. He has presented his work nationally in over 50 dioceses and internationally as well. Deacon Larry, we're grateful that you're here with us today to share with us a tool that you've developed about accompanying those and guiding and walking those who have a developmental disorder, particularly those with autism. And I turn the floor over to you to lead us through these initial 2 modules of healthy relationships. Deacon Larry.
Hello, my name is Deacon Larry Sutton. As you learned from the first session, I'm most interested in trying to help and work with individuals who have an autism spectrum disorder, usually what's considered a higher functioning disorder, in navigating part of the world. I was caught off guard a number of years ago when I discovered a very young man who was admitted to a juvenile prison. He was admitted because of sexual activity with a peer in his school, and so was consequently arrested and then sent to a juvenile prison, which had a program to work on sexual related issues. That particular prison houses individuals for 18 months or more. As he was introduced to some of the rest of the population, the guard that was with him introduced him to some of the basics to getting started. 2 of the things that they introduced him with was a wash rag and a toothbrush. Well, he had seen a wash rag before, but he had never really seen or didn't know what a toothbrush was. And my thought was at the time, how complicated it is to teach higher level functions with individuals who don't have the basics. How could it be successful if you don't have a common baseline between either group members or basic knowledge of certain necessities, so to speak, with individuals as a common factor for all? So it was at that point, and this was probably 2007, 2008, somewhere in that time frame, I began writing Healthy Relationships, a curriculum to work with individuals in the spectrum, autism spectrum, teens, young adults, on the basics to help them first with rehabilitation, but perhaps as importantly, it could be used as a primary prevention tool. Skills thought to be assumed that they should know how to do these types of things, and yet many do not. The program is divided into 3 modules: basic hygiene, human sexuality, and relationship development. Of course, the most interesting part, I believe, is the relationship development. But in order for it to mean as much as it can, you have to have these other modules at a basic level. So it's starting off with simple things. But let me begin with sharing my PowerPoint at this point, if I can. And this is the second part of the 3-part series on recognizing people with developmental disabilities who are incarcerated or detained and identifying tools for effective ministry. The areas of need. These individuals, these men and women with autism, often think very concretely. They know terminology or need to know it, but they often only know certain specific terms and a single definition for some of those terms. They often lack basic knowledge in certain things and yet know a great deal of detail about other things. And very often, their social skills and their social language is lagging. Curiously, and I'll talk about this in other aspects of the various trainings, is that individuals may have a very high intellectual level, an IQ that's average, above average, even to some, with some as gifted, and yet their social IQ is often much, much lower. I make this point very clearly if I have to go into federal court, for example, and describe mitigating circumstances, that although this person is intelligent and you might think that they have basic knowledge in these certain things, but once they're taught, once they learn a particular behavior in a certain way, they're kind of stuck there unless they're taught a different way or a replacement behavior for that particular need that they may be trying to pursue. Oftentimes it's in the social area. They see what others are doing, they'd like to do the same, but they don't have the skill sets in order to do it. This is particularly the case with dating or with making relationships, basic friendships with others. The impact is that they sometimes get into legal trouble. They don't have many meaningful relationships. They're not really involved in their community. They might go to church, but they typically, for the most part, can't compete in sports and can't be involved in other, or don't find themselves involved with other types of community activities. And there's social and employment problems. Often their lack of social language or social understanding makes them easy marks for bullies to be picked on. You know, common way of typical bullying in a classroom is that students who may not be as fully prepared for a test on a given day and are sitting behind an individual with autism, at least they know that, or they know that the individual is very highly sensitive to sound and noise and things of that nature, might sit behind and begin to tap the back of their chair. Very annoying, but often not heard by many around them, except of course for the individual in the spectrum who gets so upset because it's so aggravating because they can't concentrate on what the teacher's about to do or on what's going on in the classroom that they explode or have a meltdown. the teacher is forced to take the individual to the principal or to the nurse's station. And by the time they come back, the test needs to be postponed because most of the period has run out. And so the bully, so to speak, has got what they've needed by postponing the test so that they can be better prepared in the future. There's also lack of meaningful other relationships, particularly with the family, in learning how to date, in social or work relationships. I've had examples, and I'll talk about this more when we talk about Module 3. When I was a part of an organization that dealt with college students that had autism, one of the schools in particular had very, very, very bright individuals who graduated with these very expensive degrees and are capable of a lot of very specific work, but didn't know how to do or put together a resume, and certainly didn't know how to do an interview for a work position, because both of those require very specific skill sets, which no one taught them. So unless they had somebody that was advocating for them who really understood autism in that perspective, particularly with somebody as bright as they are, these are skills that they didn't possess as of yet and didn't recognize the need to learn them prior to that time. So what they end up doing often, and particularly that was the case with these individuals from that prestigious college, is that they would sit at home. They weren't doing many health or wellness programs. They weren't exercising, for example. Rather, they often played video games and watched television, and were often more or less by themselves, except with family members. They had difficulty making friends. They didn't know how to make friends. They never really understood it. And when they saw their peers doing different things, particularly as they became a teenager, dating, for example, they wanted to do that as well, but they didn't understand the process of doing it. As a result, and as I suggested earlier, they often become the targets of others. They're used by others, and they're easily victimized, particularly on social media. This is what you should look at. Or they were teased or bullied on social media for not having what one might refer to as common sense in certain areas. So how do we develop healthy relationships? If you're a teacher or a clinician, you might start with the basics. You learn to build skills, that one block builds upon another, and slowly you increase knowledge, slowly you increase social understanding. My recommendation is that you do a program like Healthy Relationships with others if you can. It's curious, but many individuals in the spectrum, if they're similar age and at similar functioning levels, seem to learn from each other. It's really important for them to ask what their peers are doing, and ask oftentimes very blunt but very basic questions. Once they get the skill base and they see how their peers are doing it for whatever reason, they begin to follow and begin to use it. Common example, one of the examples of a young man was a fellow that did two very difficult types of behaviors. Sorry that it's his basic knowledge, but I'll use it anyhow. We ended up developing an exercise, a specific lesson on the use of toilet paper. And we had a roll of toilet paper there with a group of 8 teens at the time. And we talked about, the group directors talked about how much toilet paper to use. And they asked each of them their questions, and they all came up with a common answer after a period of time. The reason why this particular lesson was developed is because this 17-year-old was always recognizable in the afternoons when he went to an afternoon class. He didn't believe in the use of toilet paper, and so he would go to a classroom and people could typically smell him coming, so to speak, which was quite unfortunate. After this particular lesson, within a couple of weeks, the faculty began to recognize that he was in the classroom already and no one knew it. The group, in effect, had set a norm or process of what one should use, when one should use toilet paper, and how much and so forth. It was a curious thing of how the group decided what was important and what the new rules were for the use of this particular paper. The second aspect for this young man was that, particularly when he was a very young child, a toddler, clothes were very tight on him, or he was bothered by them. And when he was more under stress or excited, they just were so severe on him that he took his clothes off. Well, as a toddler, that was much, much less of a problem. He was in a single parent home where it was he and his sister. Again, as a young child, it may or may not have been as much of a problem then, but now he's 17. His process every day was to come home and take all of his clothes off. And if you ask him, doesn't that bother your mother? Oh, no. And he just started laughing. What about your sister? Again, he gave the same response. What if his younger sister brought a friend over? And he just started laughing again. He says, why would that be a problem? Well, we did something unusual at that point to add to the lesson. It was for a school assembly. We discovered that the FBI does a lot of teaching in the classroom. And we used that particular example. He used it. In fact, he raised the question because he wanted to show us that it wasn't a problem. And the FBI agent was very basic, very matter of fact by saying, if you have younger people younger than a certain age, and you presented yourself in that way, that is with no clothes on, that was considered child pornography because you were exposing someone to something that they didn't necessarily expect and certainly wasn't asked about or whatever. And it really scared him for the first time because he viewed somebody from the FBI, the same as a police officer, the same as another authority figure, as the absolute law. And as a result, that changed. Now, he didn't put a lot of clothes on after that when he was home, but it was enough to basically cover himself and not be exposing himself to others. Sometimes very specific, concrete examples of things in a way that they can see it or hear it or understand it is the best way to do some of this teaching. With each of the modules, there's a pretest to see what they basically know. We have checks for understanding. We track each person, and then we do a post-test just to see if there was areas that were missed or that needed to be redone at that point. We also had retention of learned behaviors by testing again some 6 months later, just to see how much was actually kept and retained. Although this wasn't the main focus of it, it was also an important factor just to see if this method of teaching for them was successful at retaining basic knowledge for the skill set. Okay, so a review. What is an autism spectrum disorder? Just as a definition, in 2022, autism spectrum disorders are affected in 1 in every 44 grade school children. Under the DSM-5-TR criterion, there are basically 3 or 4 sets of criterion that one needs to pay attention to. One of the basic ones is the early onset of symptoms. These symptoms need to take place while the individual is a toddler. That is, from birth until 5 or 6 years of age. Now, particularly if you're the firstborn, or if the individual is the firstborn for their parents, they don't necessarily have that book of rules to say what's supposed to happen at this given time or that given time. So they don't often recognize behaviors or certain symptoms as symptoms or problems at all. They may have a concern, but they don't know how to really put it in perspective. So it's often missed, but as long as they can remember it and can provide specific information, it's very useful. So it's a developmental disorder. And it's also described by the severity of the symptoms. As I described in the first town hall meeting, these symptoms are essentially in categories. First is communication, the acquisition of expressive language or the use of it, and whether or not they understood express language from others. They didn't just respond with words. It didn't make any sense. They could clearly understand what it was that they were to do in response to somebody giving them a command, for example. Socialization, particularly with their peers. You know, just as a reminder, oftentimes individuals in the autism spectrum have difficulties relating to similar age peers. They either like to be in charge, and so they're very good with younger children or younger people than they are, or adults. So they're either good followers, where adults will do the accommodations so that everything's okay, or younger children will look up to them, and they can still play by their rules, for example. They're often very blunt with their descriptions of things, very concrete, and quite don't understand why someone might be upset with them when they ask, why is he bald, or why is he so fat, with their graphic descriptions of, for example, somebody's body type, because they're giving accurate, blunt statements about the person, and yet they don't have the social niceness that many around them seem to, because they don't know those words to begin with, and they don't know why they're necessary if they do know some of them. And then the third major category, of course, is repetitive behaviors and sensory symptoms. Or they'll line things up, do things over and over again, have patterns of things, say things over and over again, things of that nature, are very picky eaters, or bothered by sensory things like tags in the clothes or seams on their shirts. The seams across the top of their socks need to be, set up just right so that they can put their shoes on, things of that nature. So how is it best to teach someone with autism? And this is probably the most important slide of all that we have. Teaching someone with autism is often best to use visuals. And I often tell families and my colleagues that even if you're a very bright individual, somebody with a superior or greater intelligence quotient, I use visuals on almost like a whiteboard or a schedule to express concepts. It may sound funny, but I'll ask a parent to almost visualize themselves with tape across their mouth so that they don't use too many words. Remember what autism is. It's a processing disorder. You take information in, you process it, you come back out with some sort of a response. If you're excited or upset, even really, really happy but focused on one thing, your processing speed, particularly when you're younger, is often much slower. So as a result, you're not able to take too much in. And the more excited you are, or a parent might be, or a colleague might be, and you get excited and upset, and you start talking faster and faster and faster, they're not going to get much of that information. So if you have a visual, if you have a picture, if you have a chart, if you have their schedule and you point to it without really saying much, they get the concept right away. They don't have to do much processing because it's very clear what you're trying to do. So you limit the verbal instruction and you try to use the visual instruction. This is good for most individuals in the spectrum. Where, of course, it's compromised a little bit is if the individual has a visual processing concern. Most that I've worked with seem to have auditory processing related issues where it takes a little bit more time. Ironically, and again, as I described in the first town hall meeting, over the course of time, that processing seems to speed up, and it's almost as if their intelligence increases, which of course, if the testing is done accurately or correctly to the full potential, it shouldn't change much more than a point or two, at least going up, unless there was some extraordinary reason at the time that they took the original test, which would invalidate it, such as a noise in the background, or an extremely hot or extremely cold room that they're being tested in, or some other type of reason, like they had a fight with whoever brought them to the testing situation, and so their mind's preoccupied with something else. You can get lower scores by accident, but not higher ones. You need to highlight what it is that they need to know. For me, one of the best ways to teach is by modeling and demonstrations and role plays. If somebody is upset and they've learned to hit their sister every time they want to get mom's attention, that's the learned behavior for many individuals a long period of time. If I want to change something, doing it at the time that they're upset, they're likely not to hear much. They're likely not to process it until after the incident occurs, to after he hits his sister, for example, at which point, I'm sorry. But once he says he's sorry, he's done with it. And literally he is dismissed it because he's already dealt with what he was supposed to do. He didn't want to really hit his sister, but he needed his mother's attention. Is there another way that he can get his mother's attention without necessarily hurting his sister? well, I often talk about working on paper. It's often a very useful thing to give them something physical to do in replacement for it. As I mentioned, I believe in the first town hall of a young man that was taught, instead of hitting walls to express his anger, which he did and broke some of the walls, that he hit doors at times. He was taught basically to slam doors to get up and do that. Problem with that individual was, as he got older, became an adult, he kept slamming doors when he was upset, which was really very disruptive to his adult peers around him. So that therapy should have continued to teach him less invasive ways to express his anger. Again, such as ripping paper, writing it down, and talking about it with someone else later on, or some other way of deferring some of the physical energy. Often teach people to express their frustration by physical things. Exercise, for example, is a good way to process at the time. Processing often takes a while, and to provide time for them to think about things is often very useful. Don't immediately ask, why did you do that? Because they may not be able to respond to you immediately. And if you can, avoid idioms, metaphors, sarcasm, things that may have more than one meaning. It just tends to often confuse them. In the assessments, it's also important not just to look for issues of autism, but trauma. So many individuals have experienced either firsthand or have seen trauma. There's mood and personality issues. There's very few of the higher functioning individuals that make it through adolescence without issues of depression or anxiety. And they still may have sensory related issues. Noise may bother them. Different touches may bother them. They get so nervous that they may pick at their skins, at scabs or various things. I was once in a juvenile facility where the staff wanted this individual to stop picking at his skin. It wasn't sanitary for the rest of them, and he was going to get sick. Sadly, what this organization did is they put him in a chair that had arms on it, and they duct taped him to the chair so that he couldn't reach himself to pick at himself. It was a day that I had showed up to do an evaluation, and because a lot of my evaluations include developmental information, one of his parents came with me. It was not a very good situation. All right. The three modules: hygiene, human sexuality, and relationships. In module 1, and I'll stop between the modules so that we can look and answer questions if they are. With only an hour, I'm talking fast, and I apologize for that. But 6 separate lessons in module 1. It often takes 6 separate lessons: washing and demonstrating hand and hair washing. I literally have individuals pour shampoo into their hands so that you can see how much they use. Sometimes you can see it, sometimes it pours over and just drips. How do you wash your hands? And again, we demonstrate both of these things. Bathing and showering. We show with supplemental films the demonstrations on how you do this. The development of individual checklist. When you go into a shower, it feels good to have the hot water oftentimes flow over you, but is that your reason for being there? No, they've got a checklist of things that they need to do while they're there, not just putting soap on the wash rag, but how to and which body parts that you need to actually wash. With the dental care, how do you brush your teeth? There's this whole separate section on this. Oftentimes, because of sensitivity in the mouth, you have to find an appropriate toothbrush for them. Again, the idea isn't to just get them through, it's to help set up a pattern of things that they can do more consistently. Toileting and bathroom etiquette. Lots and lots of problems with this. Driving along interstate highways and turnpikes, especially in the summertime. It's not uncommon to see individuals, when I would go into the restroom, people lined up using the urinals, but one individual, or sometimes more than one, will have their pants down to their ankles because they didn't know that's not what you're supposed to do in a public toilet. Puts them at very high risk for other people that may take advantage of them in these situations. Um, I'll show you one of the videos that we have that help teach that. Bedroom and sleeping areas and how they're organized, and we talk about privacy in this module. Now, with luck, I'm going to be able to go to my lessons. I can. Okay. Jared, are these visible?
Not yet, no.
Okay. They're visible to me. Well, I'll talk them through if you can't see the modules as I've described them. This is part of the curriculum of healthy relationships. I'll go into the bathing and showering part. First, we provide what the materials are. We need soap, washcloth, towel, shampoo, conditioner, whatever, deodorant, mirror, razors, shaving cream, etc. We'll use this sometimes on a flip chart. We'll have them make their own type of idea of what they need to do and what order that they're going to do it in. I'm sorry this isn't visible. I couldn't practice on myself when I was trying to roll this out yesterday, which means that the video is probably not going to be available either.
If I may, Deacon Larry, if you hit share screen again,
did it go up?
You should have the option of choosing a different window to share.
Okay, thank you. There we go. How about that?
There we go.
Okay. And you can see the lesson is how it's set up, the instructions on how to do it, what's involved with it. I'll go through a couple of these and I'll show some of the videos. And again, the idea of this is to essentially explain a little bit why it's necessary, but I keep that at a minimum because I want them to know what it is that they should be doing. And so we'll practice it almost like a mantra. I would start each group by asking people to wash their hair, and we would simulate washing the hair or washing their hands, and I would have them show them to me. It sounds very basic, and most individuals, when they first start out saying, I know how to do all this, this is very stupid, why are you forcing me to do this? However, as we go along, it becomes a little bit more difficult for them to do some of the specifics, and I don't hear that complaint after the first or second session. It's just something that this group does. And again, it's to help ensure that they're doing it correctly. Include within it the various tips. Let me see if I can get this one up. And Jared, you're my theme point. Can you?
Yes, I can see that sheet.
Okay. Okay. I'll show the videos in a second. You may notice that there are 2 videos for the same tower. Well, you can read that. All right, so I'm going to go back. Well, sorry about the technology stuff. We're going to do the sharing now again. Were there any questions so far in what I've done?
If you all have any questions as we go along, please feel free to put them in the chat, and myself or Kara will make sure we get those over to Deacon Larry when there's an open space for questions to be answered.
I don't think that one's actually going to come on with the with the videos, unfortunately. So I'll continue then with these. Okay. See if it does it this way. Does that come on, Jared?
I can see it, and on your share screen button, there's a checkbox to click share sound so that people can hear it.
I haven't showered in a few days.
Perfect.
My mom has been hassling me, so I guess I will get it over with.
It's not too pornographic, I don't think.
Whoa, that is cold. Hey, where's my shampoo? Geez, this shampoo is getting everywhere. That's good enough. It's too hard to get the soap out. I don't know where I put my washcloth. More is better, I think. My chest is the only thing I want to wash.
Okay, it goes on and it goes through. This is the not so good showering, the things that individuals may miss. And again, it looks very basic to try to understand this, but the idea is that the concrete thinking and maybe going through on what they're trying to accomplish at the time and the lack of a skill set to know what is the most common ways or the most adequate ways in this instance of taking a shower and how to do that. I hope that makes some sort of sense. I'm going to go back to lessons. Okay, we'll try this one.
Time to wash my hands. I need a towel and some soap. First, I'll turn on the water. Get my hands all wet. I need enough soap to get my hands soapy and sudsy. To get my hands really clean, I have to scrub the back of my hand. Between my fingers, clean my fingertips, wash the palm of my hand, as well as around my wrist. To make sure that the germs are all gone, I'll sing happy birthday 2 times while I wash. All done. Now I'll rinse off all the soap. Shake the water off my hands, turn off the water, and dry my hands. Now I am ready to go.
It's a very basic type of instruction, but what happens with the visuals is that it's very concrete for them to understand. So it's important for them to know what it is to do step by step, and this provides an opportunity for them to understand it. Let me see if I can go back to, it's hard without getting the interaction. I'd like to see if there are questions about it. And again, it looks very basic, but the problem with basic is if you don't understand, here's an unsafe one. I mentioned before I would play the video on using the toilets. First the unsafe version, and then I can show the safer version.
How's it going, bud? You know that weather chick, she's pretty hot, eh? Hey, man, mind your own business. I'm trying to make good company conversation. Man, it's weird when you're talking to somebody in the bathroom. What's wrong with him? No, what a jerk. Just trying to be friendly.
And then we would go back to looking at the more correct way to use the toilet. You might ask, why are these things important? I'll explain after this is done. If you're raised by a single parent, or in most homes there's not likely to be urinals. Individuals that go into school then on the highways and use public restrooms don't necessarily understand the skill sets or the skills that are necessary to use a public toilet, and what's the appropriate patterns or methods to do. They don't usually find out that they've done it wrong until they get confronted by somebody because they've done something wrong. Those that are basically taught to greet somebody when you first meet them or first run into them can find themselves in a lot of trouble with areas like that. All right, other areas of such as privacy. I think one of the things that's a bit overlooked with regards to dressing in general is that when individuals with autism or young children, they are often cared for by many different types of adults. Maybe it's at daycare, maybe it's strictly in school, depending upon what they may have had. And they've been all kinds of counselors. In Pennsylvania, for example, there we have the ability to I can write prescriptions to have counselors come to your home. And so many different individuals may be working with the individual. They don't learn the issues of privacy. They get dressed in front of other people. It's routine that they may be changed when they're younger by other people, so they don't understand the issue of privacy. One almost has to teach them directly what privacy is. And although they may not fully understand it in terms of why the rules are that you do this in private areas, if that makes some sort of sense. They don't have the same notion of dressing in front of someone else, or using the restroom at home with the door open, or showering again with the door open. They need to understand what's considered private. So we go through very specific steps of when we can do certain types of things. Where in the home can one do things in private? The home in general, in the bedroom, the bathroom, being alone in your room with someone or being alone in the bathroom with the door closed, with the blinds and curtains shut, camera and computers turned off, the intercom, including baby monitors, turned off. Again, a checklist, because they don't necessarily recognize the need or the importance of these things, other than that it's a rule. A lot of the information provided here, I thought was important to put almost as rule-based. When it's done in a small group, the group decides what's important for this, and it's facilitated again by someone that's been trained in the program. Again, the notion is, and reinforcing it, that these are good rules to basically have when you do various things, whether it's in the prison's kind of an awkward way to say it, but when they leave incarceration, or when they're in a halfway home, or a place of that nature. Okay, I'm going to switch over. Any questions, Jared? No.
Yeah, we have one question come through as to how might these early habits present in later adulthood, particularly for someone who might be incarcerated?
They don't know the social rules. I think that one of the clearest examples that I learned that I had to help them to figure out a different way, help the staff to figure out a different way to manage things. The Youth Development Center that I worked in, the juvenile prison that I worked in, had a very good program at the time, and they would go over their offenses in small groups, talk about ways of rehabilitation. What was occurring is that a lot of my students, the individuals there that I were working with, they were in the autism spectrum. When I would talk with them, they would talk about their offenses at times over the course of time because of the lack of privacy and so forth within that group. They would begin including information that these other individuals were saying about offenses into their own descriptions of what they had done in the past. They were incorporating the behaviors of others. They were called fantasy journals. They were including them into their own journals of things that they could do or shouldn't do in the future, but they're going to do what their new best friends were doing. I think it frightened many of us when we realized that these were individuals that didn't know how to make friends. They were incarcerated with people for a minimum of 18 months. It was often closer to 5 years. And while there, they were meeting people that were sentenced there for a similar length of time, who were becoming their best friends, and they were emulating what their best friends were doing and how they reflected what was important, what wasn't important. We had our individuals initially in the autism spectrum housed with other offenders, sexual offenders, that were basically there because they were trying to harm others. It was a very clear distinction. And although that number wasn't very high, because the young men with autism were so vulnerable to others, easy prey to the others, they began to befriend them and share with them the ways that they would get on with people or how they would interact with other men and women outside of the facility. So we had to be very careful about that because their social judgments were so limited, so poor, which was obviously of much concern. Hope that answered it a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we had one other question come in. As a chaplain, we come across people with bad hygiene habits. How do we best report this in a helpful, productive way? Or how do we help the resident?
The best way to that I found to help is to model things. You see how I'm dressed. You see the cologne that I'm wearing. You see how I keep my hair cut. Show me your daily routine. Can we put together a daily routine? Let's put it on our checklist to see. And if we do that, I want you to show it to me next time I come in. If you have regular interactions with someone, particularly in the spectrum, they don't really have individuals that are focusing that kind of attention upon them. I had a young man, it was very complicated. He never used toilet paper. He was a junior or senior in high school. He was very high functioning, which meant he had an IQ that was, in his case, well above 100. And he would just laugh when his teachers would say, you really, when you use the toilet, you really should be using toilet paper. And he would just laugh at them. Because of being raised in his situation by a single mother with he and his sister, clothing when he was young bothered him. So the first thing he would do is he would go home and take off all his clothes. And he would be essentially nude from the time that he got home each day until he went back the next day. And when asked, what about your sister? He said, well, she doesn't care. They were a couple of years difference in age. What about her friends that they'd come over? And he would just laugh. We decided to tackle these two problems in two separate ways. In terms of the toileting, we had a group where how much toilet paper do you use? And we literally passed a roll of toilet paper to each of them. It was agreed upon how many sheets go within each pad that they would use, 2 or 3 or 4 sheets. And they would pass it around, and the group decided this is how much toilet paper we use when we go to the toilet. And the irony to part of that was after a few weeks from that lesson, the teachers started to comment to each other that they couldn't tell he was coming, that he was all of a sudden invisible in terms of the odor that preceded him when he would go into the rooms, because the group decided what they should do. Now, in terms of the taking off the clothes because of the sensory problems, which isn't something you describe it, it's a good example of what it took. He didn't know that there was implications to that because he had always been allowed to do that at home. That was never a problem. He didn't have a skill set or a reason for not doing it. It was much more comfortable for him. He'd been used to it then for 16, 17 years. So he just didn't want to do it. I was able to bring the FBI has a good community education type of program. And so I brought him to I brought 2 agents to the facility, and we asked that question, you know, if you're at home and you're 17 or 18, whatever he was, and your 16-year-old sister was there with her friend and you're walking around without clothes, 15-year-old sister, is there any problem with that? And the agent went on to say in a very matter-of-fact way how he'd be charged with the various child pornography regulations that existed and what the implications and how much time in jail he would be there for because of exposing those young women to his undressed body, which freaked him out, of course. But he got it from who, again, he considered an authority figure. And again, from that point forward, although he wasn't happy about it, he was more scared of the potential for incarceration than he was for not wearing clothes.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the examples you're offering there, and I think one of the key things I latched on to what you shared is the helpfulness that detailed lists can have in addressing some hygiene habits, and depending on whatever facility you might be in, you may be able to write down a paper list that the resident can take with them and check in with them next time there's a visit. So thank you for that example.
Yeah. I mean, although in the curriculum itself, which is rather substantial, you have examples of all these lists and things to use. It's also not rocket science. It's something that you can look in a very practical setting. What is it that he needs to do in which time. If there's if he spends too much time in the shower or bathing or whatever he's doing, you can set up various rules and then come back and ask him with a guard, how did it go with these times? Let's work towards that. Let's, various types of positive reinforcement that you can give, because what's the reinforcement that is likely more important to him or her? It's the amount of time that you're spending with them, that you can give them that individual attention. And if you're able to do that in blocks of time for someone and check the list and review the list individually with him, he'll recognize the importance of the list. He'll keep using the list. He'll want to show it to you all the time, almost in an obsessive way. But that's where you have to weigh as a counselor, as a minister, what's my objective with this? Am I trying to get him so that he's easier to approach, or that it's a cleaner way of living, or it's, he doesn't smell, or whatever the nicer way is of saying that? What's your objective to it? And by spending focused time when reviewing his materials, he gets your attention. He gets to review this obsessively sometimes, and yet he's accomplished what you've asked him to do, which is the main idea there. In the human sexuality part, I'm going to go on to the next module. It's also just a short series of lessons. It deals with human development, changes in our bodies, puberty, very explicitly, but not pornographically, looks at male genitalia, female genitalia. There's a sexual part, which I'll come back to in a second, and pregnancy and childbirth. One of the exchanges I needed to make when I partnered with Wesley is that it's not a Wesley Spectrum, it's not a church-based organization. So it doesn't describe how to have sex or anything of that nature, but it talks about it as a topic of discussion. I have a fourth module, which I've hesitated to put together on living as an adult with human sexuality for couples that will potentially put in at some point, but it isn't present within this curriculum. I'm going to go now back to figure out how to do it again. Back to share screen. Oh, here we are back already. Okay. And just to give you an example, we'll look at the terms and definitions I have a poster of a naked male with the genitalia. They're able to identify at the end the parts of the body. And they're also able, both with male and female anatomy, to look at the slang that's involved. One of the easiest ways to get bullied is if individuals are talking about things using words that you don't understand. You're likely to you'll be teased pretty significantly or bullied.
We're still on the PowerPoint, Deacon Larry.
I'm still on the PowerPoint. Okie dokie. They didn't teach me this in Deacon School. So I apologize for that. Is this better?
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a slow learner sometimes. Let me come up to the beginning where I was reviewing. In the lesson itself on male genitalia, the opening session would review the rules. We give a pretest, talk about the various parts of the male body that would be focused upon so that they could identify them. Go over it in somewhat more detail. Talk about items such as an erection, ejaculation, orgasm, wet dreams, how to take care of your physical self. And then there would be a post-test. I'm going to try to come down again and go back to the left. Oops, sorry. I believe I have the picture of this is okay. We don't have the pictures of this on here. Coming with the curriculum itself are large, almost poster size pictures of male and female anatomy, so that they can look at the parts and understand them and have an idea of what those parts are for. Again, the idea from including this was to provide them a basic understanding of the differences between men and women, how to take care of oneself, what's involved in human sexuality, what's involved in conception, how babies are conceived, what goes on with a child. It's interesting, the notions that people keep on. I had an individual once, when I evaluated them, a young woman that was convinced that I was telling her lies about how pregnancy occurred. She was very, very interested in a group of men who found her very attractive, and she wasn't concerned about spending time with them on her own, because her mother said, just make sure that you never drink anything. And because she was, of course, afraid of some sort of sedative type of medication put into her drinks. So what she was concerned about is making sure that she watched whatever anybody was giving her to drink and refused to do that. She was attractive and socially naive, and made herself very vulnerable. When I showed her a picture of a pregnant woman where the baby was next to the stomach, she says that poster's wrong. You can't become pregnant by swallowing something. The baby's in the stomach. It's a very graphic picture, and she really didn't understand the process, which basically led us all to think at the time that she was very vulnerable to being hurt by someone, because she really didn't get the rules with it. And so the various posters that we have included, which is important to know because they don't necessarily understand how they're getting in trouble. They don't understand situations of how they get set up to be bullied. They don't recognize bullying. I made this as a premise. I'm going to stop sharing and come back to my other screen. I'm going to stay at this screen. The notion in part was, if they knew basically how to care for themselves in a physical sense, if they knew the basics about human sexuality, including things like social diseases and so forth, then they could be ready to go on to what I was considering the most important part, or the part that I wanted to get into, which was relationship development. How do I make a friend? How do I differentiate a friend from a bully? How can I tell when somebody's taking advantage of me? How can I, people tell me I talk too loud in a room. What is room voice? And how do I practice that? How do I dress in certain situations? There's a exercise in the next module, which I'll show next week, Thursday evening, which is called 44 questions. I believe the questions are all on us. You can see them. I'll have the individuals sit behind each other. They had been with each other now for, in effect, maybe 16, 17 groups together. What's the color of the eyes of the individual sitting behind you? What color is their hair? What food do they like? What's their favorite movie? What music do they listen to? And there's 44 of these. After the first question or two, their heads drop because they really don't know anything about the person that's sitting behind them. They know a lot about themselves and what they're interested in, but they don't know the other person. The notion at that point is, if you want to make a friend, if you want to have a longer term relationship with somebody, these are important things for you to know about of the other person. And so when the exercise was over, they all got out together and they started interviewing each other to see if they could learn this information about the other person because they wanted to be friends with them. It sounds very simple, but the logic, the concrete logic of how they go through to figure out things is what's most important. It's not necessarily logical from an educated perspective. Even though many of them are very, very intelligent, they don't necessarily have that type of common sense all the time in every situation unless they've been put in it before. They have to develop these skill sets in order to get it. Once you get it, they feel very empowered that they can do these things. They understand these things. They'll follow what you're suggesting. They'll follow the rules. Again, in the juvenile prison, what we ended up with was a very safe place, but the guards were very emotionally drained because when they found out that these people would actually listen to them and help them, they would cling to them almost. So it was a very emotionally draining place, but there were no assaults, there was no aggressive behaviors. It was a different world. I took all those that were identified as being in the autism spectrum, the young and the old, and put them in separate buildings, separate from the other offenders. And it was probably the safest of places to be, but it was also one of the hardest places to work because of how much one had to invest in terms of that type of counseling with them. So it's all good stuff because they were learning what it was they should be doing, how they should ask it. It's very difficult and very emotionally draining. They were likely not to be offenders again because they knew what they were supposed to do in order to meet their needs, whatever that happened to be. And we can talk about that at some point. Now, I know there's only a few more minutes. Jared, were there other questions?
We had some words of affirmation coming through in gratitude for recognizing the importance of direct teaching and learning what's what and how that can helps inform us in the ministry and the work that we do. I will say, Deacon Larry, I think it was in the previous part, you had shared that in a study you did, 64% of those that you had worked with were undiagnosed on the autism spectrum.
Right.
And I think that is such a powerful statistic for those of us who are in this work to remember that whether we know it or not, someone that we're interacting with in our ministry is likely undiagnosed in their autism. And having some of these tools in our kit to recognize and to help support and accompany those individuals in whatever small way we're able to, it can make a big difference for those individuals.
Thank you. And I think, well, two things. The pragmatic part of the curriculum that I keep referencing is that particularly next week's, we'll talk about adult living. How do you live outside and enjoy living outside? You're not by yourself necessarily. And the second was the paper that I attached to the first talk, where the 64% was actually referenced. It's hard to believe. And again, it's not a high percentage of those with autism that actually offend. But when they do, they end up in jail and people don't really get them. And these are methods that you can successfully replace very aberrant behaviors with things that are not unacceptable. Mm-hmm. So the idea for me was I didn't want them to reoffend. And if this could be done early enough, they may not get to the point of having to offend because they know what they're supposed to do instead, which is why, a lot of it's based on younger individuals, except that it's been very successful with older teens and young adults. The concepts that were just never taught. You don't know what to do when you come into a restroom. You don't know what you do when you go to a restaurant. You don't just yell across the room, to get, you shouldn't, to get a waitress or waiter. So I'm out of time, but other questions, or are we okay?
No other questions at this time. We have part 2 or part 3 rather coming next Thursday evening. We'll have that in the announcements here in a moment. So please, if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to shoot them over to us at our info@catholicprisonministries.org email account. We'll make sure Deacon Larry gets those and we can address them. With that, I do have a few closing announcements that I'd like to just make everybody aware of. So as mentioned, next Thursday, October 27th at 7 p.m. Eastern. So that's a time change, 7 p.m. Eastern, not our usual 1 p.m. Eastern, but 7 p.m. Eastern. Deacon Larry will be talking about part 3, the third piece of the module. And this session centers on relationship development, modeling, and practicing day-to-day living and interactions in a safe way for people with developmental disabilities. In this session, he'll talk about replacements for aberrant behaviors, skill sets necessary to make and keep friends, and how to meet needs without hurting others. So that'll be a really important and third installment for this conversation. And I think we'll see a lot more tools and pieces that are particularly prescient for our work in prison and jail and ministry as well. Coming up after that on November 1st, we have a special event that you all may have heard about and seen in some of our emails, is Reclaiming Wholeness. It's an exploration of addiction, recovery, community, and spirituality. We'll be joined with the Cardinal Joseph Tobin. He'll be moderating the discussion. 3 other panelists on there to talk about the realities of addiction and incarceration. We know that for a fact that 80% of people who are booked into a jail or prison are done so under the influence of some sort of substance. 60% of people who are incarcerated have an addiction of some sort of substance use addiction. So we'll have the Justive DuPage out of the Chicago area. We'll have Jim Wahlberg, brother of famous Mark Wahlberg, video producer. The Ignition Spirituality Project will be on board as well. And as I mentioned, Cardinal Joseph Tobin. Registration is free. Please make some room on your calendar to attend this really, it's going to be a really fascinating, really heartfelt, compassionate event to make us all more aware of what we can do to accompany those affected by both incarceration and addiction. And you can find all that information on our website for registering, and it'll be popped into the chat as well. And then coming up in November, we have our November webinar on racism with Dr. Patrick St. Jean, the Jesuit priest. He'll be talking about racism, including a discussion of his book, The Crucible of Racism, Ignition Spirituality and Power of Hope. Upon coming into the United States to pursue graduate studies and then to embark on the training as a Jesuit, this Haitian-born priest discovered something he had not known before: racism. And to these experiences, Dr. St. Jean applies the basic principles of his Jesuit formation, the discernment of spirits, the examination of conscience, and the imaginative identification with Jesus and his sufferings, death, and resurrection. He'll talk about that, some conversion experiences, healing, and resurrection in a way that we can move forward as a church in a spiritually compassionate and real way when it comes to the issue of racism that so many are affected by. So those are the highlights of what we've got coming up. There's always a lot going on. I encourage you to check it out on our website there, register for those upcoming pieces. And as mentioned, next week, Thursday evening, we've got part 3 of this series. So with that, I thank you with gratitude for your presence. Deacon Larry, would you like to close this in prayer before we close out?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to spend time together, to understand better some of those that we may end up working with that may be affected by things that are not fully in their control all the time. Please help us to treat everyone that we work with, that we come across, with dignity as we seek and ask your help. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you all.